Welcome to the great outdoors, aka the most amazing, expansive, beautiful toilet. I'm out here to do my individual duty, both literally and figuratively, to save the planet from the virus, the cancer, known as humanity. Now, I live out here in the middle of nowhere in the tiniest of tiny houses, and I do so love the idea that my individual consumption creates a demand that the market will ultimately respond to, and if enough people become as smart as me, the world will get better. That's why everyone should check their species privilege and go vegan. They should stop contributing to the 0.025% of plastic in the ocean made up of plastic straws by using paper ones. And you know what? They should go number 2 outside, producing fertile soil for the community garden where, over the course of a year, we can produce enough food to feed a single human being for a couple of weeks. All tomatoes. That isn't to say I don't have a few guilty pleasures. Like, when I run out of tomatoes, almost immediately, I go into town and buy groceries, and sometimes even catch a movie, like almost always from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. One of my favorite MCU films is Disney's The Muppet Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, the story of a man named Ebenezer Scrooge. In the beginning, Scrooge is a greedy banker, which someone is going to say is anti-Semitic because they don't realize it's also anti-Semitic to associate Jews with bankers in defense of either. To counter that, let's all just take a moment to acknowledge the virtuous profession of banking. Anyways, I don't love the end. Jesus Christ. Anyways, I don't love the end where Scrooge was giving away turkeys like that question mark guy claims the government gives away grant money.
Next year, the government's going to give out over $350 billion, and those who know about the programs are the ones who get the money.
Anyways, one day a pair of Robert Owen types come in and ask Scrooge to donate some money for their efforts to feed the poor. That beautiful tightwad said no, obviously, and that the poor should go to workhouses, and workhouses sucked. Basically, you could trade labor for a place to stay, but the living conditions were intentionally grim, so only truly dirt poor people would do it. These do-gooders replied with, and this is a direct quote that really embodies how well Dickens holds up today. They replied with, "What the hell, bro? Most people would rather die than do that shit." Scrooge shot back with, "If they'd rather die, they better do it and decrease the surplus population, bruh." It's in my eye. I mean, you gotta admire how well the dialogue stood the test of time, right? You see, Scrooge knew how important it was to degrow the economy because there just aren't enough resources to support this many people. It's not necessarily that there are too many people, mind you, but it's just that there aren't enough resources. Just kidding, that means the same thing. Think about it for like 5 seconds. I mean, the world was overrun with people 175 years ago when Charles Dickens' Disney's The Muppet Christmas Carol and Iron Man 2 were written, and we've got literally 7.5 times as many people now. How did the world ever get so overpopulated, so full? There's just nowhere to go. Just in case you can't sense the sarcasm or don't know what satire is, I, Peter Coffin, who am in a costume to be silly, actually believe that overpopulation and degrowth are anti-human bullshit. I think they're tied to eugenics, and I don't think less is more. Less is less, and you, no matter who you are, no matter what your background is, as long as you're not at the top, you deserve more. Further, all these forms of anti-growth are examples of the same kind of ideology, all meant to cover up the major flaw inherent in capitalism, one that causes crisis after crisis. Less sucks, so cultivate some mass. We're about to take a huge dump on Malthusianism.
Time they turn the lights down, just wanna go that extra mile for you. Your public display of affection feels like no one else in the room.
surplus population is a term Charles Dickens has his famed tightwad Ebenezer Scrooge used to establish that the character agreed with the then popular ideas of a man named Thomas Robert Malthus.
Humbug.
The term itself refers to unproductive consumers, a segment of the population providing nothing, quote-unquote, socially necessary, while also using up valuable resources. You know, welfare queens, Netflix employees, and people who don't seed torrents for at least 24 hours after they're done downloading. Those people should just die. I'm kidding. Also, don't seed torrents of copyrighted material or pirated software. You don't want your internet company calling up the ham. Anyways, Malthus, an unfortunately real person that Dickens didn't make up for a story, published an essay on the principle of population in the year 1798.
Meaning that both Dickens and Malthus's careers were built on writing fiction. Hey-o!
Before we go into that, though, it's important to know that he wasn't the first person to raise a version of this concern. Centuries earlier, Plato, noted writer of Socrates fanfiction and democracy hater, had expressed concerns about overpopulation when Earth only had around 150 million people on it, less than 2% of today's population. In one of his most prominent works of Socrates fanfiction, Republic, Plato put forward that population growth was unsustainable not only because of the demand for food and resources, but was also one of the biggest causes of war. The thing that I think should have clued people in to how full of shit Plato actually was his idea that in a just world, philosophers would rule because only they understand what is good, and what is good cannot be clearly seen or explained. These philosopher kings had the burden of their massive superiority constantly weighing them down. However, did they survive?
Socrates says I am way smarter than these unwashed masses. They don't even know what good is, something that I know a big time. Oh, what's that, Socrates? You're saying I should be in charge? Oh, I agree, Socrates, I agree.
That's so bad. Now, wouldn't you know it? Plato had the idea that the philosopher kings would impose legal restrictions on reproduction. Let's call them Bang rules. They did this to create balance and harmony. Obviously, the philosopher kings weren't subject to the Bang rules, though, and were allowed to bang without restriction. I mean, we want more eternal smarties, right? And less big dummies.
I slam my penis in the car door. You slam your penis in the car door.
Less idiots buying tubs of pre-made chocolate frosting to eat as a snack. How could that go wrong? More on that later. Point was that Plato wanted to achieve a stationary state in terms of population, believing it would end hunger, class conflict, and even wars of conquest.
Attention, all citizens. Stand by for an important announcement from the President of the Society.
My fellow citizens, it is with a heavy heart that I bring you the findings of the Council. In unceasing efforts to find a solution to the devastating problem of overpopulation threatening to destroy what remains of our planet, Earth can no longer sustain a continuously increasing population. As of today, the 1st of January, childbearing is herewith forbidden.
This would be good for Plato, a philosopher, because then no one would want to oust the philosophers who would rule over everyone just because. By the time Malthus's work became popular in the early 1800s, the human population had grown to about 1 billion people, well over 6 times what Plato thought could possibly be sustainable, making Plato look like a
Bitch.
Still, Thomas Robert Malthus reintroduced to popular concern the idea that humankind would soon outgrow available resources, just as the sycophants of today's ruling class continue to do.
The famous theory put forth in 1798 by Thomas Malthus that population grows exponentially, but water and food do not, has not really changed. We've improved food growing, yes, but it's still finite.
Like Plato, Bill Maher, and Adolf Hitler, Malthus proclaimed that a finite amount of land would be incapable of supporting a population with supposedly infinite growth potential.
The planet's resources are finite, but our predilection to always be down to fuck apparently is not.
Which eventually made Malthus
Look like a bitch again.
So let's just quote this bitch verbatim. In the first edition of 1798's An Essay on the Principle of Population, Malthus asserted that
population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. A slight acquaintance with numbers will show the immensity of the first power in comparison of the second.
To break it down, Malthus's original claim is that while increases in food and resource production occur in a linear fashion, increases in population occur exponentially. Which makes sense because industry only ever scales in a linear What? Okay, whatever. But the human population endlessly expands forever. What? Well, no matter. Regardless of these things, food production just can't keep up with... What?
Yet another stupid bitch. Are you seeing a pattern?
Many, from OG dialectical materialist Karl Marx to Julian Simon, a pro-market liberal environmental economist of the Chicago tradition, have been able to recognize that graph as flimsy. In Theories of Surplus Value, written in 1863, Karl Marx extensively debunks Malthus's entire body of work. He not only noted that Malthus was a plagiarist, but also that he misrepresented and even sometimes outright misunderstood the theories he plagiarized, then changed up his justifications whenever called out. Marx wrote,
Malthus' Theorie was taken from James Anderson. His Principles of Political Economy was a polemic work written in the interest of the capitalists against the workers and in the interest of the aristocracy, church, Tacitus, Toadies, etc., against the capitalists. Where Malthus inserts his own inventions, it is pitiable. Malthus' work was a lampoon or mockery directed against the French Revolution and the contemporary ideas of reform in England, Godwin, etc. It was an apology for the poverty of the working classes. Furthermore, Malthus took the Andersonian theory of rent to give his population law an economic and a real, natural, historical basis. While the nonsense about geometrical and arithmetical progression was a purely imaginary hypothesis. Anderson had defended premiums on corn exports and duties on corn imports, not out of any interest for the landlords, but because he believed it would reduce the average price of corn and ensure even development of the productive forces in agriculture. Malthus adopted Anderson's assertion because he was a professional sycophant of the landed aristocracy to justify their position economically. Malthus defends the interests of the industrial bourgeoisie only when they are identical with the interests of the aristocracy against the mass of the people, the proletariat. But where these interests diverge and are antagonistic to each other, he sides with the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie. Hence his assertion of the unproductive worker, overconsumption, etc.
So here's where we begin to understand what Malthus was ultimately doing. He's not defending capitalism per se, he's actually slyly attacking it.
Not for the right reasons, mind you.
Rather than identifying and criticizing the contradictions of the system and ultimately siding with the working class, he was telling industrial capitalists to know their place in defense of the property-owning aristocracy, the church, and ultimately the mode of production we call feudalism, which at the time was crumbling and, needed some support, you guys.
Nah, when I went to go visit the feudal mode, something was just off. There was something about the feudal mode's energy that just wasn't right. The room was just, dense with negativity. He was giving off some really distressed vibes. Do you think he's doing okay? It's just really important to be sensitive to feudal ways of knowing. 19th century economists like me need to be more empathetic when we act and speak. Like we really need to, you know. Just hold space for feudalism. I'm really just worried for him.
Not exactly advocating for a flat hierarchy, but At least he hated the industrialists and their modernism and their factories and their food. And development is bad. Like, we should reduce production. Mother Earth can't handle it. We should go back to living like primitive societies, building our own homes, growing our own food, making our own bombs. What? What did I just say?
Today, we live in a world where the capitalists won. The feudal aristocracy has been replaced by the bourgeoisie, the previous middle and current ruling class. While the class for whom Malthus was a professional sycophant for has all but symbolically disappeared, his theories have persisted. They haven't become any less wrong, but yeah, they're still around. We produce an excess of food nowadays, so much that a lot of it goes to waste. Because of this, arguments similar to Malthus's on food are often put forward with the substitution of generalized resources for food production, which, like I said, is a severely outdated concern, though still contrasted with the world human population. In Capital Volume 3, Marx talked of the implementation of momentary and forcible solutions of the existing contradictions, violent eruptions which restore the disturbed equilibrium for a while. Basically, the present state of affairs becomes untenable as conflicts and discrepancies build. Then a series of events pacify these contradictions, albeit at a great human cost. In response to crises, the capitalist ruling class implements policy that's ranged from propping up massive failures of institutionalized finance capital at the expense of the worker both here in America and abroad in the wake of the 2008 crisis to, well, both world wars. Prosperity at the cost of human life in one way or another. Anarchically violent and destructive means are utilized to temporarily restore stability without actually ending any of the fundamental contradictions that generate these crises.
Anyways, the boom part of the cycle was obviously mirrored in the human population. I mean, we called it the baby boom. It's the sole event in human history that truly embodies the conditions that the idea of a Malthusian catastrophe puts forward as necessary for one to happen. But, much to the chagrin of hunter-gatherer fetishists, society didn't collapse.
As the productive forces developed, the standard of life increased and the family model responded. People started having 2 kids rather than 6, partly because both parents began working and partly because the kids were surviving. Feeding 6 of them is a lot of work. Population regulated itself. Birth rate tapers off and becomes linear after the 60s, despite growth in production of food and other resources outpacing human population growth. When there are more people, linear growth, that is, having the same number of births as the previous year despite the existence of more people of childbearing age than before, means the birth rate actually goes down. More people having fewer kids.
We don't call that the baby bust, though, do we? That might remind people of the boom and bust cycle that pervades society as long as capitalism's fundamental contradictions persist. But thing is, people were noticing them anyways. Like the 1960s were rife with crises of imperial stage capitalism, from groups oppressed in the imperial core demanding civil rights to the imperial state waging an unpopular war in a newly formed communist state. The New Deal and the World War that powered it only averted a crisis and temporarily made things look shiny and new. But the rot beneath, the inequalities and the perceived scarcity that created them, caused a reaction.
David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain during the First World War, came to a peculiar realization as the Great Depression kicked off.
If we had not had a great war, if we'd gone on as we're going, I am sure that sooner or later we would have been confronted with something approximately like the present chaos. There must be something fundamentally wrong with our economic system because abundance produces scarcity.
David Lloyd George identified that there was a flaw, but not what it was. The fundamental contradiction of capitalism is that everything made, as well as all of the wealth generated from it, is retained by the class that owns the means to produce it. This is the heart of all inequality. Production is where power comes from in modern capitalist society because it is through production that all things happen. What Lloyd George and everyone else missed was that it was just the capitalist ruling class doing what a capitalist ruling class does. So really, this scarcity is perceived by the workers because it is exerted on them. Further, it reinforces an ideological line that everything is limited and that the good life is only for a select few, those who prove themselves in the great free market. So, the wealth of this vast world is accumulated and concentrated among a tiny class of capitalists. This prevents the workers, their subjects, from not only simply accessing the world's resources, but from even understanding how they work.
What is the inherent flaw regarding the logic of limited resources? This logic fails to take into account that the way human beings interact with resources has constantly been in a state of change. Across Africa, minerals are being extracted and sold at high value currently, when just several decades ago they were worthless. Computer chip technology has rendered them very valuable. The long-predicted peak oil scenario in which the petroleum would run out, causing a global catastrophe, never panned out because new methods of extracting oil from deep-sea drilling to hydraulic fracking have been invented.
See, the way the society uses resources is always in flux. The takeaway is that there is no stationary law to our relation to natural resources. As our technology develops, we should have more choice as to how resources are used and which ones to use. The true issue is that everything from the media disseminating information to the mining equipment pulling resources out of the ground to the factories where production occurs is owned by a class of people with a set of material interests that contradicts everyone else's. So, this is all done as cheaply as possible and sold back to us at a premium. Not only are they ripping us off, but they're polluting and devastating the earth. Don't like that? Well, that's the capitalist mode of production.
If we, the people, had the power, wealth, and ownership, we would have to make decisions democratically. Like, there would be no other alternative, right? And you think we'd be ripping ourselves off? Do you think we'd be polluting the world without actively converting to a consistent zero-carbon baseload, I don't know, like nuclear power? Do you think we would vote to swim in our own shit? But we can't vote no on that, can we? And sure, I could say that's how I would do it, but I don't have any power. I'm not ruling over anybody. I'm out wandering around in 100-degree weather dressed like Ted Kaczynski in the woods, getting bit up by mosquitoes. This is not what dictatorship looks like.
This is all the result of the way the relations of production have arranged society. There is no fundamental truth that necessitates this, no decree from God, nothing more than an unspoken social contract that was signed long before any of us were born. So, why don't we just change it? Well, Malthus's principle of population is easy to adopt as a framework to claim the way society has historically played out isn't the result of structures that can be changed as criticism unearths their fundamental contradictions, but rather the result of supposedly unquestionable laws of nature. In fact, there's a good chance it's a significant reason why a lot of people think capitalism works because of human nature.
Of the two worldviews, there is only one that allows and acknowledges human nature, and one that necessitates humans be inherently altruistic, whereas my worldview allows for the human nature of some people being good, some people being turd nuggets, and allowing them to make their own decisions, and the invisible hand of market forces to mitigate the damage, as opposed to the damage that can be done in a centralized power.
This paints the capitalist world as a natural order where the superior humans, the owners and directors of production, will naturally rise to the top, and the inferior ones, the unproductive consumers, will sink to the bottom. The inequalities inherent in capitalism and previous socioeconomic systems are therefore supposedly explained, and all those doing nothing of merit need to know their place.
Also, if the ruling class just let these unproductive consumers mooch too much, they're gonna overrun the earth.
It's not hard to see how the people at the top would benefit from this view of how things are. These types statistically pollute the most, as evidenced by even slippery charts trying to diffuse blame among the top 50% by talking about lifestyle consumption emissions. Nice try, Oxfam. It's still visible that the top 50% do barely anything compared to the top 1%. And even so, you're not addressing where the power really comes from here. But seeing that the capitalist ruling class funds charts like this to explain why the Earth is so bad, it makes perfect sense that they would look at the issues of sustainability and longevity of the human species and see population itself as the problem, rather than, I don't know, flying a private jet everywhere, demanding bluefin tuna decorated in edible gold garnished with lobster while their fracking investments pay off because their other investments in the supply chain paid off, and the interests of one feed into the other, and so on and so on and so on.
Why face the idea it might be inefficient modes of production and distribution, ones that might waste and pollute more but are cheaper and yield higher margins, when you benefit more from just not facing it?
In 2009, some of these owning class folks, David Rockefeller, Bill Gates, George Soros, Warren Buffett, and others, formed something they, for some batshit insane reason, decided to call the Good Club. As in, if you go against our club, you're clearly bad because we are good. Obviously, it says so in our name.
There's no reason at all to be suspicious of me.
The global health portion of their focus was on disease and overpopulation. The Guardian, a left-leaning news outlet most considered to be mainstream, characterized pushback on this as conspiracy theories that are coming from the American Christian right. Yep, to be concerned about anything Malthusian sounding was characterized by the mainstream left in 2009 as religious right-wing conspiracy, which is obviously bad. This club, as clearly stated before, is good. They're very forward-thinking and progressive, and they just want the best for themselves. All of us. And that means knowing who to call. It's really convenient for the capitalist class to characterize any pushback on their assertion that there are too many people as anti-progressive.
We cannot hide away from human population growth because, you know, it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
If progressives think that the problem is population, then progress, the thing progressives want, seems like it might just be addressing the surplus population, which capitalists would never be considered the surplus population in, capitalism. Again, they're supposedly the cream that's risen to the top. They're supposedly more vital as people, leading us towards a better future with their capital. They invest in the technologies of tomorrow. They aren't disposable. They shouldn't be the ones to starve if there are too many people for the capitalist mode of production to sustain. So a lot of progressives blame people who are not capitalists. Instead, the problem is people who have children and buy food at Dollar Tree. Whether they realize it or not, they're defending the mode of production that generates inequality and isolates the decision-making process of all of these things to the capitalist ruling class.
Keeping in mind that perspective, it's pretty easy to see why socioeconomic systems rooted in these ideas would be kept in place. It's privilege and insurance all at once. It's comfort. It's power. There's no incentive to end these systems, and these viewpoints will probably never truly die under them. Capitalism is supposedly the only logical answer to questions of humanity's essence, human nature, supposedly immutable, unchanging natural law at the center of all of us. But human nature changes alongside ideology, which develops dependent on the mode of production as it creates contradictions that need justifications. What we call human nature in capitalism is an assumption informed by the fact most people will never have enough and therefore can never get enough. The false scarcity the capitalist ruling class has to create to compensate for their oversaturated markets depends on their subjects accepting that assumption. But everyone could have enough, more than enough. We'd have different assumptions, too, if we knew for sure that we would never go hungry.
When people stop believing in these ideologies, either due to apparent contradiction, changing conditions, or systemic crisis, the capitalists really start noticing how big that surplus population is. So, when Malthus asserted endless exponential population growth was inevitable, the solution he put forward was to regulate the population. He gave two ways this could be done. Either the death rate goes up or the birth rate goes down. When Scrooge said to let the poor die off to decrease the surplus population,
if they'd rather die, then they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
it was a reflection of the popular interpretation of Malthus's work. The poor have always been blamed for the conditions they lived in, and when discussing this in relation to overpopulation, it was said that helping the poor would worsen conditions for everyone in the long run. From an essay on the principle of population.
Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. If by these and similar means the annual mortality were increased, we might probably every one of us marry at the age of puberty, and yet few be absolutely starved.
We don't help those sickening poors. Sure, it feels like the right thing to do, but they overpopulate the world if you help them. The poor should live worse and shorter lives to increase the death rate so we can live in abundance. We, of course, being the ruling class Malthus made a living kissing the asses of.
Also, is it me or did Malthus throw in a little hint of actually it's ephebophilia at the end there? Like, was he writing the shit to defend Lord Epstein? Fuck!
In capitalism, the ruling class is supposedly not ruling because of their lineage, and the poor supposedly have the freedom to become rich. An illusion of upward mobility must exist. People have to believe that they just need to prove they're worthy.
Do it! Yes, you can!
Of course, it is a rigged game, so most can't, and if they can't, well, they were part of the surplus population.
We just don't need the vast majority of the population. The future is about developing more and more sophisticated technology, like, again, artificial intelligence, bioengineering. Most people don't contribute anything to that, except perhaps for their data. And whatever people are still doing, which is useful, these technologies increasingly will make redundant and will make it possible to replace the people.
More and more, everyday people are seen by the capitalist ruling class as a burden.
If this is starting to sound a lot like eugenics to you, that's because it pretty much is.
So yeah, Malthus really could have been writing for Epstein, who wanted not only to fuck kids, but also to create a master race with his own superior DNA by impregnating women at his ranch. According to a 2019 expose by the Irish Times, at one session at Harvard, Jeffrey Epstein criticized efforts to reduce starvation and provide health care to the poor because doing so increased the risk of overpopulation.
And that's why next, we're going to talk about eugenics.
The span in time that Malthus, Dickens, and Marx occupied was one of growing consciousness in the underclasses of the capitalist world. In particular, the horrific institution of slavery was increasingly questioned in a country where freedom was a founding virtue. And in that question, the question of what is freedom leads many to uncomfortable answers. If indeed the United States was a land of opportunity and upward mobility, why were there so many poor? Didn't they have the freedom to succeed? In efforts to preserve slavery and otherwise keep labor as inexpensive as possible, this all had to be rationalized. This necessitated effective, seemingly unquestionable ideological suggestions that certain people were superior to others. To accomplish this, several hundred years of philosophy and ideology had to be synthesized. Plato and his Republic carry a lot of generalized responsibility here, and we'll circle back to that shortly. But the specific idea of waste people being put to good use goes back much further than Malthus to the 16th century British colonization of what would come to be called America. In 16th century England, a policy of enclosure, the annexation or theft of common land from commoners, was formalized by Parliament. These acts of enclosure had been going on since the introduction of the feudal mode, however, and had driven many of the peasants from the countryside into the cities of England with nothing. And as they crowded into the city streets, open disdain for the poor grew along with their numbers. Formalized inequality was created by privatizing the common land. Later, informal inequality was created by appropriating the profits to the owners of industry for them to accumulate. As capital became the dominant power, the feudal mode died a slow death. At the same time, the primary contradiction of capitalism was making its presence known. Many had nothing, while few had everything. The many that had nothing built up, desperate for work, but without enough work for them to do. Malthus would come to call this the surplus population, but London-born clergyman William Harrison presented rationalization long before in 1577's description of England. According to Harrison, rather than wanting to work, these poor were simply idle by nature. Their wasted energy wasn't the result of an economic condition, it was a failure of the poor to settle and find work. None of this was the result of fundamental contradictions and shifting power relations, they were just waste people whose lives amounted to nothing of value. In Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, the author chronicles, among other things, British colonial policies dedicated to taking out the trash or relocating the growing surplus population to put these waste people to good use. This transatlantic human population shift, combined with an aristocratic fixation on animal husbandry, propagated a specific way of describing the poor, not only as waste, but as inferior animal stocks too.
If you recall, Ebenezer Scrooge of Disney's The Muppet Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens was against helping the poor in any way. He offered the idea that if the poor wanted to die, they should do so to reduce the surplus population. But why would they want to die? Most people want to live and even improve their situation over the course of their life.
Amir Farsood has applied for medically assisted dying, known as MAID. He lives in constant agony due to a back injury, but has started the process for end of life because his rooming house is up for sale and he can't find anywhere else to live that he can afford. He barely survives on Ontario disability support payments. He doesn't want to die, but being homeless is not an option.
I know in my present health condition I wouldn't survive it anyway.
Farsood meets the criteria for MAID, physical suffering due to disability that cannot be relieved.
I don't wish to be dead.
And that's now. Way back, the reason the poor might want to die is because the alternative was staying in workhouses where they could trade labor for a place to stay. The inhumane living conditions of these workhouses were intentionally grim to make them a choice based purely on survival, and no upward mobility of any kind was offered. But when you're calling people the surplus population, implying that there is an overage of people, it's often an indicator that there's not enough work for everyone. If only there were some kind of new world to exploit. One of the principal promoters of American exploration and exploitation was Richard Hakluyt, who engineered a plan to send this swath of waste people of inferior stock to the soon-to-be colonies, creating a new, continent-sized workhouse. In terms of stated goals, this plan was a success. As Eisenberg put it in White Trash, the land and poor were cultivated together. Britain's new workhouse was an easy way to take out the trash, ultimately converting the trash into a valuable asset by having it cultivate, produce, and ship useful commodities back to Britain.
So maybe instead of calling it taking out the trash, we should call it recycling, because how environmentally friendly, right? Converting waste into something useful? Like, were the English the original tree huggers or what?
Speaking of labor, founding father and third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, owned 600 slaves over the course of his lifetime. In his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he tried to rationalize why he was allowed to do that in the country that began when he himself wrote the words, "All men are created equal," in the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, attributing human equality as a law of nature.
Yeah, so that shit must have been a pretty wild contradiction to carry while wandering around his 5,000-acre Monticello plantation, ordering people around that he owned his property because of the color of their skin.
I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of body and mind.
I don't know, if you kidnapped me and forced me into slavery in, like, Finland or somewhere where they don't speak English, I'd probably seem uneducated and uncooperative, and pissed off, to be frank. Black people's perceived disposition under U.S. slavery seems pretty self-explanatory to me. Not exactly science, so to speak. But saying, I suspect black people are less intelligent, isn't science either. It's a notion from a guy. A pretty powerful guy, but a guy. And one of the selling points of capitalism was that some guy wouldn't be making all the decisions anymore. The market would. Everything, including ideas, competed in the market, and only the best succeeded, right? For slavery to be justified, there'd have to be something that proved it made sense in a country where everyone was born equal. The idea of black people being inferior would have to prove its merit, right? Like, there would have to be something seen as scientific proof that held up to the scrutiny of the day that made it completely okay to treat black people like work animals.
So, craniology. Around the same time Thomas Jefferson was suspicious that black people are dumb, a man named Franz Joseph Gall was developing a new field called phrenology. Gall asserted that the brain was made up of 27 individual organs and that by feeling a person's head, one could reveal their natural tendencies. However, phrenologists didn't view these as limitations, and in fact, phrenology developed into a kind of realize your true potential self-help thing that can only last so long, and it was considered debunked as a pseudoscience by the 1840s. Fortunately, there was another, totally different thing called craniology, also known as craniometry, that picked up right where phrenology left off. Phrenology, old and busted, was about how the brain had a bunch of organs that dictated personality traits, so you could tell shit by the shape of a person's skull. But craniology, the new hotness, was about measuring brain size by the skull, and also that the shape of different skulls proved that races were actually different species. Craniology was the brainchild of a man named Samuel George Morton, who wanted to disprove that God created humanity as one whole, instead believing that God actually created different species of humans.
It's kind of like if someone hated penne, but loved ziti. Yeah, sure, I guess they're different things, and one can be used to justify racism, but wow, are they categorically the same thing? Like, you're not going to prove that God did either of those things any easier than you're going to get most people to care that you used ziti because you were out of penne. Also, ziti's racist.
What tipped Morton off to this revelation of polygenesis was that the sons of Noah, of Ark fame, couldn't possibly account for every race on Earth. Obviously, the only logical alternative to that is that all races have been separate species from the very start, right? Now, again, we're just talking about some guy's notions, as Morton was keenly aware of. So, he engaged in an incredibly ambitious project to provide evidence for this claim. He collected hundreds of human skulls from all over the world, cataloged them, and measured them. I don't know what he did with the actual skulls after that, because A&E's Hoarder show didn't exist for another 150-ish years, and that's the only way I would be interested enough to look into it.
And whether he let them pile up at his house or had several storage units around town to maintain an image of normalcy, I don't know. But he did claim that this was evidence that proved one could judge the intellectual capacity of a race by the average size of the skulls he had measured.
Large skulls, according to Morton, meant a large brain, and therefore high intellectual capacity. Also, he asserted a small skull indicated the opposite, because, like with most body parts, bigger is better, and that's that. Just ask porn. Also, different skull shapes could dictate various personality types. Also, this is all obviously insane and wrong. Like, no rigorous research would support any of these conclusions.
Both elephants and whales are examples of animals with significantly larger brains than ours, and although they are both cool and smart, don't want to piss off the elephant or whale fandoms, they can't really compete with humans in terms of intelligence. And that's okay, like humans can't compete with them in terms of dongs.
So, brain size doesn't actually mean anything in regard to intelligence. Similarly, we have about the same brain-to-body mass ratio as mice, yet mice haven't invented a self-driving electric vehicle that runs into parked cop cars yet. So they aren't smart. With some basic comparisons, though, we find that neither size or density makes a brain exceptional.
Essentially, Morton was full of shit.
Nevertheless, in 1839, Morton published Crania Americana, in which he claimed that white people had the biggest and therefore best brains, while black people had the smallest brains. Science, he said, had proven black folks are not good brain people and to no hire for smart job, to use a direct quote. The book was also written entirely in crayon. In 1857, George Glidden and slave owner Josiah Nott, followers of Morton's, used their scientific reputations to defend the institution of slavery. They published a book called Types of Mankind and made claims saying things like black people achieve their greatest perfection, physical and moral, and also greatest longevity in a state of slavery. 2 years later, in 1859, Charles Darwin's work on evolution provided an explanation for how life went from nothing to something in a way that didn't involve God. Now, Darwin himself was kind of wishy-washy on the topic of race, believing races were different enough to categorize them on a fundamental level, but also he held a hard stance that slavery was appalling. But we aren't really talking about Darwin. Also, not believing in slavery doesn't make cheap or free labor cease to be more profitable than expensive labor, though, does it?
Now, he had some major problems regarding race, but Darwin's theory shifted the conversation away from God and ziti to evolution and, I don't know, burritos? It's not like that's a good metaphor either. I just wanted to mention the ziti thing again, because, you know, probably somebody is going to think that I actually called ziti racist, and I wanted to say that's not what I'm doing, like that was a joke. And it's not even that I wanted to say it was a joke, because I don't really think that you actually think I'm calling ziti racist. I just wanted to mention the ziti thing again.
But it was one of Darwin's biggest fans, Herbert Spencer, and Darwin's own half-cousin, Francis Galton, who would apply his concepts of evolution to perpetuate Morton's contention that science could categorize human races by intelligence, even as the conversation departed from religion and into more general natural sciences. In 1864, Herbert Spencer published Principles of Biology because it was apparently really in to name long-form literature promoting one's notions principles of something. Now, Spencer was an unapologetic supporter of laissez-faire capitalism, as he believed that struggle caused self-improvement, which was also something Darwin's work influenced him to believe is genetically passed on. Spencer's idea of survival of the fittest, yes, he's the guy who came up with that, was directly influenced not only by Darwin, but, yep, principle of population, Malthus's work. In fact, page 1, sentence 1 of Spencer's theory on population is him quoting a guy saying another guy's assertion that Malthus's theory is false. Now, if that confuses you, don't feel bad. It sure confused me, but what he's saying, right off, is that Malthus's theory is true. Further, he believed that overpopulation would lead specifically to the fittest taking their rightful place on top, and everyone else would just die out. Basically, Spencer pulled the age-old culture war move of taking whatever negative thing is said about you or your beliefs and replying, "Yes, but it's good." To sum up, Spencer was like, there are too many people on Earth, and that's fucking great. The superior white people will know just how to use the situation, and the other races will be too stupid to do anything but die off. Hell yeah! Herbert Spencer's writings were seen as imperative contributions to scientific racism, which is the belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify a belief in racial inferiority or racial superiority. A lot of belief going on there. If that doesn't sound a whole lot like science, it's because it's not. The assumptions of racism have been widely and routinely debunked through the years, especially since the discovery of DNA. Physically, people of different races just aren't different on any fundamental level, and even so-called European skin color has been shown to have genetic origins in Africa. Regardless, the Spencerian take on evolution transforms Darwin's work into vindication from market capitalism, while ultimately claiming yet another variation of the idea that savages are less evolved and incapable of higher thought.
Spencer also cited craniological studies of skull size and capacity in the tradition of Sam Morton to support this because, of course.
Another thing worth noting happened in the midst of all this. The United States Civil War made slavery in the country illegal. Mostly. This didn't stop race science, though. First, because freed slaves were starting with literally nothing, and there needed to be ideological explanations for why black people, when free, seemed confined to the lower rungs of the working class in a society where all are supposedly free to succeed. But secondly, even a lot of people with anti-slavery views didn't necessarily believe all humans to be created equal. For instance, here's Charles Darwin saying that civilized, aka Western, aka white nations were filled with a race of people with larger brains, larger morals, and larger dicks than the lower races, which were, everywhere else. On the very same page of The Descent of Man, the book this quote comes from, Darwin cites Hereditary Genius, the work of English polymath and all-around unpleasant-looking man, Francis Galton. Galton took influence from both Darwin and Spencer's ideas, ultimately proposing that modern societies afforded those with hereditary defects the ability to survive despite an inability to adapt. Which he saw as a problem, to be clear. Yeah, this guy, which is weird, because he looks so happy. Galton disagreed with Spencer, however, that free markets were a good mechanism for clearing out the chaff, though, because markets developed the productive forces, and well-developed productive forces could potentially feed, clothe, and house more and more people, which, on its own, is correct. Which, to be clear, that is what capitalism does right. It develops the productive forces, thus creating abundance. What Galton overlooked was the fact that that abundance was not evenly distributed. In fact, it was appropriated almost entirely to the owning class, the capitalist ruling class. But I guess that the hypothetical was enough for him. Galton instead believed in rational planning. No! Not of the economy and productive forces, though, but instead in more forceful ways, like state-mandated sterilization.
All this disagreement between people who are working to ultimately preserve the same world order. It's almost as if said world order is itself contradictory and must be supported by a series of conflicting ideologies taking precedence in a cycle based on what sounds plausible at the time.
Galton's work was the synthesis of the previous decades, informed by everything we've discussed, and it was called eugenics. So a series of thinkers took influence from Malthus's work and came to their own conclusions, but can we characterize this line of thought as specifically Malthusian? Is it reasonable to connect the concerns of overpopulation and eugenics? If only Malthus had used the word eugenics in his text somewhere.
And I Control-F'd it, and it seems like he didn't. And as all modern thinkers know, that's the only way to figure out what historical figures thought. I also couldn't find the N-word, so that means his ideology didn't affect black people. Man, that sucks. Malthus never said the word eugenics, so that means he never talked about it. Guess there's no connections.
Or maybe it means that Malthus liked eugenics before it was cool, way before Galton even came up with the word. He actually mused about the possibility of what we've come to call eugenics in 1798's An Essay on the Principle of Population.
By an attention to breed, a certain degree of improvement similar to that among animals might take place among men. Whether intellect could be communicated may be a matter of doubt, but size, strength, beauty, complexion, and perhaps longevity are in a degree transmissible. As the human race, however, could not be improved in this way without condemning all the bad specimens to celibacy, it is not probable that an attention to breed should ever become general.
What's interesting here is that he asserts the ideas we would come to know as eugenics probably wouldn't become popular. He didn't think people could be convinced that sterilizing the lessers, the bad specimens, was an acceptable thing to do. This is a rare time I wish Malthus was right, but again, he was wrong.
Are you seeing a pattern?
But that's not really a program, though. Yeah, it's certainly the basic principle behind eugenics, but if only someone could connect Malthus with Galton. A smoking gun that connected the entire sequence of events and made it make perfect sense.
Alas, history rarely affords us such a simple answer. Except right here. Right here, history affords us such a simple answer.
In his 1869 book, Hereditary Genius, Galton cites, reworks, and improves upon Malthus's work, building on Malthus's concern about the procreation of what Galton called poor quality humans, which, if you recall, Malthus proposed that by attention to breed, a certain degree of improvement, blah blah blah, courting the return of the plague, yada yada, cast off the surplus population. What Galton fixed was that he believed Malthus's idea of delaying marriages to later in life, at least until the population problem was resolved, would only be followed as a suggestion by the most sensible people, thus only culling the good stock rather than the waste people.
Having kids is such an important decision.
We're just waiting for the right time. Pregnant again!
I got too many damn kids!
There's no way we could have a child now. Not with the market the way it is, no.
God, no.
He don't care about you. Yeah, well, there must be something he likes over here. Well, we finally decided to have children, and I'm not pointing fingers, but it's not going well.
And this is helping.
I'm gonna fuck all of y'all! That's my boy!
Unfortunately, Trevor passed away from a heart attack while masturbating to produce sperm for artificial insemination. But I have some eggs frozen, so just as soon as the right guy comes along,
Because of this, Galton said this would need to be enforced on the entire population to achieve anything. Galton and Malthus ultimately agreed that the biggest threat to humanity was the lessers reproducing without limits. Galton added that he thought the growing surplus population would continue to create misery, reinforcing negative passions like the envy of the upper classes, something later repeated by anti-communists like Helmut Schoch and Natalie Wynn. Malthus and the ensuing so-called scientists with similar notions ultimately inspired Galton to believe that human reproduction and/or lifespan must be limited and controlled so that not only would the genetic quality of humanity increase, but also that, at last, the problem of surplus population could be solved. The inferior masses whose lives are not worth living would cease to be if they reproduced less or not at all, and thus the genetically superior would flourish. This was sold as the solution to poverty, but it kinda sounds like genocide, doesn't it? The poor needed to be seen as unmotivated, inferior thinkers who could never raise themselves to the position the ruling class is in, the slave races even more so. How perfect does it work out for this ideology when they pointed out that the non-working members of these groups were destitute? These folks still needed to consume food, still needed resources and housing, but the mode of appropriation was not designed to accommodate them. So if we just could breed out the unmotivated, inferior thinkers, society would just be really smart people who rise to the top.
I've been working so hard for so many years, you know, it's like cream always rises to the top.
Dude, and you're like made of cream, dude, and your cream is all over his face, man, you know what I mean?
That
and he
pisses
hates
him
that
off.
shit, dude.
I'm always
He hates
putting
that
my
shit.
cream all over his
Dude,
face.
you're like
and it
all
pisses
up
him
in
off.
his face.
Oh my god.
We would have intellectual pursuits to occupy our energy, and we'd be smart enough to only breed with other smart people. All we would have to do is get the surplus population to stop banging everything that moves.
The planet's resources are finite, but our predilection to always be down to fuck apparently is not.
Also, slaves aren't human, bro. They're livestock. We can make them reproduce however the hell we want. While Galton was part of an intellectual paradigm that can be traced back to Malthus, again, Malthus wasn't the first. Just like with overpopulation concerns, we can look to Plato for an alpha version of eugenics. Apparently everyone with bad ideas just rips off Plato deep cuts.
Told you we'd circle back to Plato. Ha! Mainly because I want people to remember that this bitch wrote a book about how him and a few other Greeks hanging out in buildings with cylinders for walls, fucking their students, should rule over everyone else every time he's brought up.
As with Malthus, Plato didn't say the word eugenics because Francis Galton invented that word much later. However, it's the same thing as eugenics. In Republic, the very same book which Plato advocates for a ruling aristocracy of philosopher kings called the Guardians, the most superior of all intellects making the choices for everyone else, who would, among other things, regulate reproduction because there were too many people, Plato also recommended a state-run mating program to strengthen, you guessed it, the Guardians. Remember the Bang rules? That's eugenics. I replaced the word eugenics in this image with the words Bang rules for exactly this reason. It's not a shock that Malthus, an influential historical guy who advocated for an aristocratic ruling class, had a lot of ideological overlap with Plato, an influential historical guy who advocated for an aristocratic ruling class.
Also, between Malthus and Plato, we're 2 for 2 on claims that there's too many people in the world and insistence that we should selectively breed humans to create a stronger race. Throw in Epstein and it's 3 for 3. Agent Smith and it's 4 for 4. Not a list of people I would want to be known for agreeing with.
The American Eugenics Society was founded in the early 20th century. U.S. eugenicists argued for the sterilization of degenerate and unfit individuals, the waste people of the surplus population. For reference, this could mean anything from the mentally ill, the neurodivergent, the physically disabled, to promiscuous women, gay people, immigrants, racial groups. Just imagine like an old Argentinian who's actually German and hangs out in a machine shop all day long. Whoever he would hate. Between 1907 and 1935, all but 12 states in the U.S. had passed or were in the process of passing forced sterilization laws. That was less than 100 years ago. Francis Galton died in 1911 and didn't live to see his ideas implemented on such a mass level, though he was both very unpleasant and from England, so combine those two things and it's likely he would have thought the Yanks were doing it wrong somehow anyway. Early in 20th century America, over 20,000 people were sterilized because of their supposed genetic inferiority, which included the poor, who, if they were genetically superior, could have never been poor, right? Meritocracy means
I'm the cream of the crop. I rise to the top. I never eat a pig because a pig is a cop.
Oh my God.
Now, all this forced sterilization and genetic sorting happened in the United States before the Third Reich happened in Germany. And, oh boy, the burgeoning Nazi Party loved that shit. Part of how it got to them was by way of a book published in 1899 called The Aryan and His Social Role, written by a staunch advocate of Francis Galton's, Georges Vacher de Lapouge. Or, if you don't like it when people say French names correctly, Georges Vacher de Lapouge. With his book, you already know the drill. He classified humanity into different hierarchized races, spanning from the dominant Aryan white race to the mediocre and inert Jewish race, distinguishing them by, among a few other things, skull size and shape.
These guys really all just cycled through skulls, overpopulation, and breeding humans, didn't they? Like, they all just seem to feed right back into each other. It's almost like these people don't understand that the scarcity created by exclusively designating all surplus wealth created from production to a tiny class of people who own everything is a false, imposed scarcity, or they don't want to understand.
Lapouge's anthroposociology helped to develop these rationalizations into a racial utopianism, a world where the guardians, the aristocracy, or whatever ruling class was seen as a race that was genetically predisposed to rule over everyone else. And because anthroposociology was regarded as a science, because all of this nonsense was regarded as a science, it could be employed as propaganda for the Nazis, one that normal people in Germany just had to trust.
Because we always just trust the science, don't we?
Lapouge himself had more specific aims with his work. First, he wanted to end the trade unionists because he and his followers considered them to be degenerate because their intention was to improve the conditions of the working poor. Remember, according to these people, the poor were genetically inferior waste people and contributed to the surplus population. Second, he wanted to prevent social conflict by establishing a fixed, hierarchical social order with well-bred, intelligent, elite individuals at the top and a disposable mass of people at the bottom. Except his version of the Bang rules became a lot more militarized than any other before. Vacher de Lapouge's work became one of the leading scientific justifications of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler had detailed his belief in and enthusiasm for eugenics in 1925's Mein Kampf, and as he took power, he implemented eugenic sterilization legislation that had been pioneered here in the United States. Legislation that I've detailed specific connection through an institutionalized lineage of thought to Robert Thomas Malthus, overpopulation genius. I contend that the ultimate conclusion of overpopulation logic is some form of eugenics-justified genocide. The Nazis didn't call it the final solution for no reason. It seems like an unavoidable practice if we agree the problems of human sustainability are anchored to there being too many people.
Whereas I, not the semi-character I guess I'm kind of playing, I, Peter Coffin, oppose the idea that humanity is the problem. That's the whole point. I specifically think that humanity is a good thing.
So, the US state was doing some form of eugenics-justified genocide before the Nazis were, and those guys took inspiration from it. Which is ironic, as the US was founded by would-be targets of such a program, waste people sent to America, Great Britain's continent-sized workhouse. But in the need to justify their own ruling class, which came about, they came to act just like the ruling class they had won their own freedom from. It's like there's some kind of cycle that perpetuates as long as there's a class of people that needs to explain why it owns everything and rules over everyone. When one says the world is overpopulated, one implies there should be fewer people, which brings up procedural questions.
Now, you've said that word implication a couple of times. What implication?
Who do you get rid of? How do you do it? Who do you stop from having kids? Who do you deprive of food, water, resources, and healthcare to shorten lifespan? Do you just kill people? If so, who? Again, some form of eugenics is the logical conclusion.
And it seems like the most prominent examples of that have gone pretty bad. Is there, like, a way to go about eugenics that's good? Wasn't Planned Parenthood founded by somebody who supported eugenics? Isn't Planned Parenthood good? Don't right-wing people use that to try to take down Planned Parenthood?
Well, yeah, Margaret Sanger did have those views, and conservatives do use them to try to take down Planned Parenthood. Sanger advocated for eugenics in her 1920 book, Woman and the New Race, which, hell of a title. But here's my problem. Over the years, Sanger's supporters have not been saying, in a world built on economic coercion, people without the means to raise children should, as a bare minimum, have autonomy over their lives and bodies in the reproductive realm. In fact, very few abortion advocates with large mainstream platforms talk about economic coercion at all. And Sanger's supporters often try to ignore her views or even defend her as if her eugenics was somehow different or irrelevant. So what does Margaret Sanger's good, progressive eugenics want to do with unfit people that places it in opposition to the evil Nazi eugenics? Rather than killing people, Sanger-style eugenicists want to stop unfit people from having kids. So that meant advocating a program that places reproductive authority in the hands of the bourgeois state and begs the rulers to only let the fit reproduce. Merciful Marge wrote the following in her 1922 book, The Pivot of Civilization, Chapter 4, The Fertility of the Feeble-Minded.
We do not believe that the community could, or should, send to the lethal chamber the defective progeny resulting from irresponsible and unintelligent breeding. But modern society, which has respected the personal liberty of the individual only in regard to the unrestricted and irresponsible bringing into the world of filth and poverty an overcrowding procession of infants, we prefer the policy of immediate sterilization, of making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded.
Maggie really does an incredible job separating herself from the Nazis here. We don't kill the defective progeny, which in the same chapter she calls the moron class. We spay or neuter them, like our pets. We forcibly sterilize them. History is full of turds, and I think that attempting to shine those turds indicates very strange priorities, often the preservation of the ruling class's power, intentional or not. Sanger is one of those turds. In a few notable ways, her actions had a positive impact, but everything that stuck eventually rejected her ideas and went a different route. Margaret Sanger started out as a socialist attempting to stop deaths from self-induced abortions by women, a noble cause. Sanger was also an active member of the Industrial Workers of the World up until she fled the US in 1914 to dodge criminal charges for distributing birth control and whatever consequence one might face for calling for the assassination of John D. Rockefeller. So far, sounds kind of badass, right? In her 1939 autobiography, she wrote,
"My own personal feelings drew me towards the individualist, anarchist philosophy. It seemed to me necessary to approach the ideal by way of socialism."
In her 1914 exile, she went to England and fell in with the British Malthusian League founder Charles Vickery Drysdale, widely considered to be the founding father of Neo-Malthusianism. After a while, that Malthusian brain rot set in, and she became very concerned with overpopulation, abandoned socialism, which she was eventually going to do anyway because it was by way of individualist anarchist philosophy, chaired a few international Neo-Malthusian conferences, turned her ass around, made up with Rockefeller, and began accepting funding from him to limit birth rates among the working class. Liberate women.
It shouldn't be a surprise that Sanger was deeply concerned with overpopulation. Were you surprised? Like the video, leave a comment, and tell me how not surprised.
Sanger published articles and papers on the subject with titles like Preparing for the World Crisis, in which she advocated a moratorium on reproduction, meaning no one having any kids, for 5 years so the population could right itself. She also traveled around giving speeches on things like overpopulation and war. It shouldn't astound anyone that a so-called pro-life movement formed against a movement saying anything even remotely close to, we need to reduce the human population. This is against human life specifically, and there is no other way to put it. The pro-life label makes a lot more sense knowing it's a reaction to what is ultimately a literal anti-life position. As with numerous other reactionary movements, this one perceived progressives doing something genuinely messed up, and due to their lack of class consciousness, just assumed that the exact opposite ideological position was the morally righteous one. That developed into the deeply reactionary battle still going on today about what is moral and what isn't, and what and how much of it the ruling class should permit. So the logic goes, there are too many people, and we need to get rid of a bunch of them. How do we figure out who we get rid of? At the very least, eugenicists consider neurodivergence and disability to be traits of the unfit. Racial dynamics often come into play too, as did for Sanger. She began speaking at KKK rallies and brought Lothrop Stoddard, a white supremacist KKK member whose work was a direct influence on Nazi Germany's race law, onto her American Birth Control League's national board. Just for reference, the American Birth Control League became Planned Parenthood later. There's also a ton of controversy anytime anyone brings up the Negro Project. At the time, it was claimed to be about agency, and to be frank, in an economically coercive society, having control over your reproductive system is ultimately an issue of agency. But can we please not forget that one of the biggest goals of any of the overpopulation solutions, eugenics included, is to quote-unquote reduce poverty. Even now, after Planned Parenthood has denounced Sanger's belief in eugenics, they simply say that Sanger lost control of the project and left it at that, doing everything possible to avoid the problem of a eugenicist who wanted to reduce the human population by getting rid of the lessers. who appointed a KKK member to the board of her organization operating specifically in black communities. If someone that outwardly pro-eugenics was doing the same thing today, I don't think people would consider it innocent.
Now, I'm not going to say I know what Sanger was thinking, and I want to assert that it is certainly possible, but I'm going to ask a simple question. With all the context I've provided up to this point, does that sound likely?
Thing is, even if she didn't like the warmongering Nazi eugenics, she still considered the working class, with special attention for neurodivergent people, disabled people, and other specific groups, the defective progeny resulting from irresponsible and unintelligent breeding. I dare you to repeat that as your own opinion on Twitter. Can you imagine how that would go? Calling black people or autistic people or people with OCD defective progeny and calling to breed them out? Oof. Funny thing, a lot of the people who would come after you would be the same people who would defend Sanger if you started talking about the Negro Project. Honestly, the whole issue is so fucking frustrating. Some suggest Sanger pretended to have these views to popularize contraception, which I don't care to entertain. For one, bitch been dead since 1966. I can't shoot off an email to ask her, hey, did you lie about all that shit you said and wrote to try to trick people into giving women freedom?
Also, doesn't that just sound like silly? Like, she's the hero women deserve, not the one they need right now, so we'll hunt her because she can take it. So Sanger's the Dark Knight for reproductive rights? No, that's fucking stupid.
Is there a good version of eugenics in terms of practical application? Not in my view. Eugenics is about establishing who is unfit genetic stock and either breeding them out or committing outright genocide. Poverty doesn't happen because the poor are lazy, dumb assholes who have a lot of unprotected sex because they don't know how to do anything else with their free time. It happens because there's a system set up which concentrates capital among a specific class of owners, and as it concentrates, more people have less wealth. Some form of what people call body autonomy in a world that, as I said, economically coerces essentially every decision a person can make, particularly punishing single expectant parents with lower incomes, is an important cause on its own. It confuses me why people still bother defending Margaret Sanger, who, at best, complicates that fight for reproductive rights and, at worst, functions as an ideological foot in the door for eugenics. For that matter, why indulge the Malthusian overpopulation argument at all if it does the same?
The old, ignorant Malthusian notions of absolute overpopulation, or the modern lugubrious chants of birth control as the necessary solution of poverty, are thus abundantly exploded by facts. It is worth noting that this reactionary propaganda is still maintained, not only in clerical and conservative quarters, but also by the would-be progressives.
Eugenics tries to answer the question, who should be allowed to exist? This is a question no one would be asking if they thought there was enough space or resources that everyone could live without impeding anyone else. This is a convenient question for the owning class because it's the one that directs people away from the contradictions of class society and towards each other. The proposed answer to who should be allowed to exist is generally not poor people or various minority groups, though. The ideologies that have sprung forth both directly and indirectly from Malthusianism have been used to explain lots of unsavory views, from why caring for poor people is actually bad, to why races of people should be enslaved, to why freed slaves are consigned to the lower rungs of the working class, to why the Third Reich should be in power. And that's all monstrous, horrific shit. We know that. But why can't we seem to get past it? How do overpopulation and eugenics transform themselves to continually dissuade scrutiny of the ruling class's unaccountable influence and control over every aspect of modern life? How do they get sublated, absorbed, integrated into the more mainstream, less genocidal sounding capitalist ideologies? What if it's not about there being too many people, but instead about there being not enough resources? And what if, instead of sterilizing them and killing them, we just made it so the poor don't have access to those resources? And what if everyone believed it was vital, even unavoidable, to do this because of impending ecological collapse?
People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Should we degrow?
The current world order of imperial stage capitalism was best described by Vladimir Lenin. The capitalist class rules through the consolidation and unification of monopoly industrial and finance capital. Though not everyone knows it by the name imperial stage capitalism, some know it as globalism, it's fairly normal for everyday people to dislike this world order. Recent polling by Axios shows that over 40% of American people are aware of what it's like to at least some extent in existing socialist countries like China, Cuba, Vietnam, or Nicaragua, and would prefer to live in something like that.
Yeah, man, fuck capitalism. Bring on the massive society-ending events that put all the bad people in their place while simultaneously calling the human population of all those it doesn't need. Imperialism is bad, and that's the form of society we have today, so civilization itself is also bad. And that's why I, the Uno Boomer, will boom up all of the buildings so much.
So, a lot of people want an end to capitalism, but that doesn't automatically mean everyone has a detailed understanding of what's actually wrong with it. And I'm not saying the viewer doesn't, but just roleplay with me here for a second. Pretend you don't know that capitalism's fundamental contradiction is the act of production becoming socialized among a working class, while the owning class retains the product and profit. Speaking of the owning class, it appears we have a visitor. It's Financy, the personification of finance capital for people who have trouble getting stuck in adversarial parasocial relationships with individual industrial capitalists. No, that guy doesn't actually matter that much. Financy does. Hi, Financy. Anyway, the primary contradiction of capitalism is the socialization of production, while the product and profit remain privatized as they did in feudal times when production was not socialized. Let's say you don't know that that is the thing that creates class. And let's also say you don't know that a state is an apparatus to maintain one class's rule over everyone else, and also don't know that the US state is an imperial capitalist one, and therefore acts in service of the imperial capitalists. Let's just say all you do know is that you're sick of the fat cats and you're tired of this shit.
We are tired of this shit. We're tired of it. Are we not tired of it?
And good for you. Genuinely, we should all be tired of this shit. So, what do? You listen to a counterculture podcast, maybe watch some leftist YouTube videos, go to a Green Day or Against Me concert, join some message board, Tumblr, or Twitter, and someone tells you to read Bookchin. So why not read some Bookchin?
Growth, too, was frowned upon as a serious violation of religious and social taboos. The ideal of limit, the classical Greek belief in the golden mean, never entirely lost its impact on the pre-capitalist world. Indeed, from tribal times well into historical times, virtue was defined as a strong commitment by the individual to the community's welfare, and prestige was earned by disposing of wealth in the form of gifts, not by accumulating it.
Oh, we've lost the morals that fortuitously put restraints upon our growth. No wonder things have gotten so bad. We're all just greedy, gluttonous, bad people. We really should get back to the classical beliefs of ancient Greece.
Earlier. It's not a shock that Malthus, an influential historical guy who advocated for an aristocratic ruling class, had a lot of ideological overlap with Plato, an influential historical guy who advocated for an aristocratic ruling class.
Ah, right. Forgot about that. Maybe Murray Bookchin means different ancient Greece? Alright, maybe not. Who cares? What does he think about capitalism?
Capitalism can no more be persuaded to limit growth than a human being can be persuaded to stop breathing.
Yeah, the problem is growth. Capitalism's main thing is infinite growth, right? Right?
Questions of growth, profit, the future of the planet are no longer single issues or class issues, but human and ecological issues.
Finally, we're getting somewhere. The problem with capitalism isn't a fundamental contradiction of socialized production and privatized appropriation of product and profit, thusly creating both a ruling class who unaccountably makes the choices that steer society and a structural flaw that creates a cycle of exploitation and crisis. You know, like I just said a second ago when I was talking about how things actually are, it's nothing like that. It's just that capitalism simply demands infinite growth and the planet has ecological limits. Maybe there's just a need to have less consumption overall, right? The last Bookchin quote leads into this passage from a 2020 book called Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World.
The thing about growth is that it sounds so good. It's a powerful metaphor that's rooted deeply in our understanding of natural processes. Children grow, crops grow, and so too the economy should grow. But this framing plays on a false analogy. The natural process of growth is always finite. The capitalist economy looks nothing like this. Under capital's growth imperative, there is no horizon, no future point at which economists and politicians say, we will have enough money or enough stuff. There is no end. The unquestioned assumption is that growth can and should carry on forever for its own sake. It's astonishing when you think about it, that the dominant belief in economics holds that no matter how rich a country has become, their GDP should keep rising year after year with no identifiable endpoint.
The author, Jason Hickel, who, to avoid confusion, is not Jackson Hinkle, printed the Bookchin quote about persuading capitalism to justify this argument. In fact, it's literally, like I said, directly before it in the book.
Bookchin, an anarchist, viewed the Earth's problems as general interest rather than the continued struggle between the classes of the rulers and the ruled. For an anarchist that supposedly views hierarchy as a corrupting force, this is very trusting that the ruling class will do the right thing for everyone else. Bookchin said a lot of shit like this, and that's likely why degrowth influencers use his work. Jason Hickel, who is himself a degrowth influencer, is one of many who represent their arguments as very obviously about the economy, to the point where they even frame themselves as anti-capitalist, all while being funded and/or promoted by capitalists.
Growth is killing us. It is the single greatest driver of climate breakdown and ecological collapse. We urgently need to shift to a post-growth, post-capitalist economy. Right now, we're trapped in an economic system that is structurally dependent on growth at an exponential rate, year after year, with no identifiable endpoints. Capitalism requires ever-increasing levels of extraction and production and consumption just to stay afloat, chewing through our living planet in the process.
Don't you dare assert that Hickel or whoever is pushing anything Malthusian, however, or they and/or their legion of extremely online fans will demand that you read Less is More, because if you think it's Malthusian, that makes you the real Malthusian. I'll talk more about degrowth influencers and the capitalists that love them in a moment. But first, more on Less is More. Advocates of degrowth would fervently deny any association with Malthus or overpopulation, and as such, Robert Thomas Malthus isn't mentioned even a single time in the main text of Less is More, so don't even try to control F it. There is a mention, one mention, of Malthus in the citations list, however. There's a book cited called Limits: Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care.
Which sounds great to someone who understands Malthusianism, because Malthus is wrong. I mean, there's only one reason why you would say Malthus is wrong, and it's because of the main thing people know about Malthus, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't really be talking about him, right? So the author, Georgios Kallis, must be arguing against overpopulation, right?
The way Kallis considers Malthus wrong, however, is that he believes Malthus was, wait for it, pro-growth. And not just pro-growth, but pro-capitalism. The guy who said there's gonna be so many people that there's a disaster because the population is growing out of control due to technological advances, and who continually advocated for the subordination of the capitalists to the aristocracy, was a pro-growth, pro-capital guy, I guess. This is actually a fairly similar problem that founder of eugenics, Francis Galton, had with scientific racist and advocate of free market capitalism, Herbert Spencer, as well as, ultimately, Malthus himself as well. If you recall, Spencer thought that it was fine that any disaster might happen because white people would be able to take advantage of it, and that's why the free market is good. And while Galton didn't dislike Malthus, he did dislike Malthus's pessimism, perceiving Malthus to resign humanity to its fate despite his valiant criticism. But where Galton believed that policy could be implemented from a place of authority, and was proven right on that single point by the Nazis, Kallis argues for environmentalists to push the idea of humanity's voluntary limiting of itself, noting our world is limited because our wants are unlimited.
I don't wish to be dead.
Here, we see instances of the two ways capitalism preserves itself. In Galton's take on Malthus, brute force; in Kallis's, ideology used to coerce compliance. As we consider either, we must remember Karl Marx calling Malthus's work simply a lampoon meant to defend the feudal aristocracy. I see it as doubtful that Marx saw Malthus as anything above cynical, calling him a professional sycophant, among other colorful insults. We can see the coercive element in what Kallis neglects to mention. Strangely absent from his Malthus was wrong argument is Malthus's main conceit of overpopulation, the one for which he is primarily known, the common thread that ran through race science and eugenics. In fact, promoting the idea humanity should voluntarily limit itself, Kallis employs a rhetoric of recreational sex, using something that sounds completely awesome to casually impart to the reader that humans should reproduce less, thus reducing the population. You know, because old religious white dudes suck and they hate sex. They hate women being able to have autonomy over their bodies, bro. That's the whole reason Malthus was wrong. Not, the overpopulation concern. It's actually that he was a square. Fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. Not a good book to cite if you're trying to tell people your book isn't about overpopulation or lowering the population, especially considering the point of Kallis's book is to inculcate the reader to a voluntary model of self-limitation ideology. But the honest thing to do is to give less is more a chance, right?
To imagine that we can continue expanding the global economy indefinitely is to disavow the most obvious truths about our planet's ecological limits. This realization first struck home in 1972, when a team of scientists at MIT published a groundbreaking report titled Limits to Growth. The report outlined findings from the team's cutting-edge work using a powerful computer model called World 3, which was designed to analyze complex ecological, social, and economic data from 1900 to 1970, and to predict what would happen to our world in 12 different scenarios by the end of the 21st century. The results were striking. The most probable result, they wrote, somewhat ominously, will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. It touched a nerve. Limits to Growth exploded onto the scene and became one of the best-selling environmental titles in history, tapping into the countercultural ethos that prevailed in the wake of the youth rebellions of 1968. But then the backlash came, and it came with overwhelming force. The report was denounced in the pages of The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Forbes, and The New York Times, and big-name economists came out railing against it. They said that the model was too simplistic. It didn't account for the seemingly limitless innovation of which capitalism is capable.
Hickel neglects to mention, well, a lot here. Firstly, the backlash was more about the Malthusian overpopulation arguments that permeate the Limits to Growth than the methodology. Hickel does the same thing as Callus here and ignores the most obvious problem and addresses a completely different argument than the one that matters. Second, the limits to growth wasn't just the result of some cool dudes having a good time playing with computers at MIT. An organization called the Club of Rome commissioned the report. The Club of Rome was a think tank founded by Aurelio Peccei, an Italian business executive active in promoting international trade, with the backing of Giovanni Angeli, the chairman of Fiat, commander of literally 4% of Italy's GDP at the time, and a David Rockefeller appointee to the International Advisory Committee of Chase Manhattan Bank. Also a co-founder of the Club of Rome, David Rockefeller. Basically, the club was one hell of an advocate for international finance capital that was willing to use population rhetoric to create concern that would back its policy ideas.
Reminds me of a more recent club, a very good club.
The fundamental point of the organization under Peccei's control was to persuade governments and imperial nations that a new regulatory body should be formed internationally by finance capitalists because they knew the world's business better than anyone else, and clearly it was beyond the bodies of states' capabilities. Limits was ultimately going to be propaganda, or as Peccei put it, tools of communication and conviction in service of that agenda. Don't take my word for it, though. Peccei specifically said so in his 1969 book, The Chasm Ahead.
Nowadays, all peoples are awed and fascinated by the new technologies they do not understand, far less dominate. In my opinion, therefore, they are prepared for quite a number of years, and on condition to recognize a new world moderator or even a new authority, set up by those who master the esoteric technologies, even if it is a far away, a supranational, non-personalized and vicarious authority.
Second, even the Club of Rome, still primarily under the control of Aurelio Peccei, disavowed the study shortly after it was published, likely because Peccei's goal was not to advocate against industry, but for the creation of new regulatory bodies directly representing the will of international finance capital. In my perception, Malthusianism was likely convenient to Peccei's motives, and his goal was not specifically spreading Neo-Malthusianism. But he died in 1984. Alexander King, a scientist and another co-founder of the club, outlived him. Spreading Neo-Malthusianism clearly was Alexander King's goal as he took over as president of the Club of Rome.
The common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like, would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap of namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself.
So, though the Club of Rome's Neo-Malthusianism is presently its primary purpose, at the beginning it was seemingly a means to popularize and justify Aurelio Peccei's agenda. And among the world's elite, the limits to growth was very popular, and still is. But to everyone else, not so much.
The best-known doomsday forecast in the last few decades was the limits to growth, which has been so thoroughly and universally criticized as neither valid nor scientific that it is not worthwhile to devote time or space to refuting its every detail. Even more damning, just 4 years after publication it was disavowed by its sponsors, the Club of Rome. The club said that the conclusions of that first report are not correct and that they purposely misled the public in order to awaken public concern.
Third, the limits to growth should sound familiar. I mentioned it in part 1 along with the author of the quote I just read, Julian Simon. Simon spent several decades debunking the revived Neo-Malthusian movement that exploded in popularity in The Limits to Growth's blast radius.
As a refresher, because part 1 probably seems like about a year ago now, this is a person who I heavily disagree with, economically speaking, a pro-market liberal of the Chicago tradition, meaning hard neoliberal, who served as an environmental economics professor at the University of Illinois.
According to Simon, he started out a card-carrying, anti-growth, anti-population zealot. But after he actually did an analysis of the numbers, the data did not support that original belief. He criticized Malthusians' lack of historical perspective and tendency to think of resources as autonomous of human productive and creative forces, as if they were independent of human action and impervious to transformation through technology, choice, and inventiveness. He called this perspective that of a closed system, one dominated by the concept of fixedness and finiteness, which gives the illusion of easy, calculable, and uncontroversial scientific results. Now, I haven't read a lot of Julian Simon's other work, but on this subject alone, Simon ends up sounding more like a Marxist than any other Chicago School of Economics proponent I've seen. Now, obviously, this is limited, no pun intended, to Simon's criticism of Malthusianism and the limits movement. Still, the limited perspective of a closed system calls to mind the previously mentioned point Caleb Maupin made about how the way human beings interact with resources has constantly been in a state of change. Maupin is, himself, directly calling on the dialectical materialism put forward by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, a method that acknowledges the world we live in as deeply connected and constantly in a state of flux.
In the contemplation of individual things, a metaphysical analysis forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and end of that existence, of their repose, it forgets their motion.
One of the most important insights Simon raises in debunking the limits to growth and other neo-Malthusian works you might hear degrowth influencers quote, despite being totally not Malthusians, is that technical knowledge doesn't occur spontaneously. We've all heard stories about some invention randomly exploding into some guy's head while he's eating an apple or taking a shit or something.
The bruise in your head. I know how that happened. You told me the whole story. You were standing on your toilet and you were hanging a clock and you fell and you hit your head on the sink. And that's when he came up with the idea for the flux capacitor, which is what makes time travel possible.
That isn't really how it happens. Simon, just as Marx and Engels likely would have, asserted that the link between needs, social conditions, and knowledge was either misunderstood or totally neglected in these kinds of abstract predictive models. This is essentially the same argument Engels posits against restricting one's investigation to metaphysics.
This method of thought has also left us, as legacy, the habit of observing natural objects and processes in isolation, apart from their connection with the vast whole, of observing them in repose, not in motion, as constraints, not as essentially variables, in their death, not in their life.
And just like with the Malthus curve, we can also easily debunk limits using numbers. With the data from limits, and assuming consumption stayed at the same level, neither grew nor degrew, one could predict that the world would run out of gold by 1981, mercury by 1985, tin by 1987, zinc by 1990, petroleum by 1992, and copper, lead, and natural gas by 1993. Essentially, all of those reserves would have been entirely depleted before the year 2000.
Did you know that gold is a vital component in printed circuit boards? So, computers, electronics, all that stuff has gold in it. If the limits had been correct, we would have had to stop making printed circuit boards in around 1981. So the NES, the Sega Genesis, the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, and ultimately the Sega Dreamcast, the absolute peak of video gaming, and then every inferior gaming console that came after it, would have never happened, and gamers would have never become the most oppressed group of people. But limits was not correct, so too bad for gamers.
The USGS reports that 50 years later, the rate of consumption has vastly increased, and rather than see depletion in these reserves of so-called non-renewable resources, they've grown significantly. Now, the numbers aren't really the thing that matters to me so much as the flawed mechanics. Numbers like this only show us as close to an objective measurement of the result as we can get. However, showing that the asserted mechanics predict the exact opposite of what actually happened does really help make the point. So, with all this in mind, it's interesting to find that Jason Hickel finds The Limits to Growth so groundbreaking, and that the legions of degrowth fans who demand you read Less is More to prove that degrowth is not Malthusian seem entirely unaware of and unable to learn about any of this context surrounding the report itself. The primary arguments of Less is More, coincidentally, echo components of Simon's critique of limits. In Less is More, Hickel rejects technological solutions to resource usage and carbon emissions, from damning nuclear with faint praise to outright arguing against it. Instead, he puts forward that we must minimize consumption so we can switch over to 100% intermittent renewable energy. You know, energy that couldn't consistently keep up with peak energy demand hours. The problem is that the only way to have constant energy with intermittent renewables is to have a base load from another source of energy. Nuclear would be a great one, but Hickel's damning with faint praise is actually one of the more generous views of nuclear in the degrowth community. Aside from that, hydroelectric is pretty good where it can be done, but not everyone lives near the Hoover Dam either. This leaves us with only one other truly scalable option: natural gas, which is what these people also argue against. Natural gas is neither quote-unquote renewable or quote-unquote clean, which defeats their stated purpose. So what about batteries, which would supposedly mitigate or end the issues with intermittence? Well, batteries are not actually an option. An average household of 2.5 people consumes 10,715 kilowatt hours per year. So for a city of 1 million people, that would average out to about 395,257 houses. So 395,257 times 10.715 kilowatt hours comes out to about 4,235,178 kilowatt hours of total consumption per year for a city of 1 million. Residential energy consumption is about 21% of total power consumption, so at the current cost of $345 per kilowatt hour, according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's yearly report, it would cost $1,461,136,670 to generate and therefore store enough energy for 1 million people doing absolutely nothing business-related, hanging out at home. There's 8 billion people on Earth and 1,000 million in every billion, so scale that up, and for the world, to store a year's worth of energy, we would need $11,689,093,360,000 for people to Netflix and chill or whatever. Again, residential power being about 1/5 total power use, let's toss in the other 4/5, and wow, it would cost something like $58,445,466,800,000.
Great. Let's see. Humanity only has 40 trillion total currently, so oof, right? Like, there's not even enough capital in the world to do that. Never mind how bad mining that much lithium would be for the planet and indigenous people who all these people really claim to care about so dearly. So, are we doing 100% renewables? Are we cutting off power intermittently?
Well, I guess the plan actually could be to reduce the population. Still, is there any way to really pin down what the motive actually is? Maybe we need to think about the mode to determine the motive. Maybe that is really how we get to the bottom of degrowth. Less is More, like Limits and Malthus himself, with his crude imaginary model depicted in the Malthus curve, insists that humanity's relationship to the Earth's resources is fixed and finite, not something that continually changes. To claim that everything is connected and that humans should coexist with nature while also claiming that we should only develop intermittent energy solutions that ultimately reduce our capacity to sustain human life should produce cognitive dissonance with any critical examination. It's a transition from a pro-humanity view of human existence to one of the supremacy of nature. The last one is key, too. With an overpopulation or degrowth paradigm, we're no longer seen as a species existing and evolving as part of Earth's ecosystem. We're somehow both uniquely above and below animals. We have the hunger and we must control it. Why can't we control it? Basically, the same viewpoint the bad guy in The Matrix had.
I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species. I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply, and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure.
Hickel tiptoes around this by seemingly embracing a Bernie Sanders approach to policy, claiming that we must redistribute to create radical abundance. However, this is where we find the limits to social democracy. The Nordic model depends both directly and indirectly on the rampant exploitation of imperialized nations to create an image of abundance in its core states, an ultimately temporary one at that. Doing the opposite of what Hickel claims. Not that a country developing industry is automatically bad. In fact, for genuine radical abundance, humanity is gonna have to do a lot of it. Now, the evil Western countries that have industry are going to have to substantially deindustrialize, but these third world countries, for their own benefit and not for the benefit of the Nordic model or anything like that, they're going to have to be able to industrialize. Curiously, though, he still imposes percentages of these countries' energy production that must be reduced. So how do these nations grow while at the same time degrowing, all at the behest of imperial nations, which extract their value in order to do their so-called redistribution that somehow makes degrowth not austerity? In case you don't catch what I'm saying here, it's all contradictory and wouldn't work. Growth is the motive degrowth advocates assert capitalism is driven by, and this is a key error. The assertion here is that motive dictates mode. However, the exact opposite is correct. The ruling motive is entirely downstream of the ruling interest. The current capitalist mode of production contains a fundamental flaw that creates classes of haves and have-nots, rulers and ruled. The motive of the ruling class, the one that makes the decisions about what happens in society, is to preserve the concentration of capital through profit and/or ownership. Any change in motive that degrowth advocates propose without a change of interest is merely symbolic. But Hickel doesn't advocate for any change in ownership, so there's no reason to believe degrowth would be done in a way that is anything but exploitative, because if ownership isn't addressed, exploitation isn't addressed. Even if his so-called theory of radical abundance agenda was implemented, it wouldn't work. It would necessarily create more inequality between the more and less developed countries, more inequality within the imperial core countries.
We've had clients come to us that have said, I've rinsed out a diaper and I've reused it. I've turned a diaper inside out and I've reused it.
And cause more human suffering everywhere. To Hickel, humanity's supposed relationship to the Earth is incoherent. We're above all other species, but uniquely destructive. We're incredibly smart and adaptable, but also can't stop expanding and consuming. As with Bookchin, this lends to thinking of capitalism as an environmental crisis we have to convince the capitalists to reorganize and impose controls so at least a portion of humanity can continue, when in reality it is, like all previous societal struggles, one of class.
Questions of growth, profit, the future of the planet
But what does that mean in terms of population? Again, most degrowth people vehemently deny they're talking about the population, but rather the population's consumption. Thing about that, though, human consumption and human existence are intrinsically linked.
Overconsumption is when the usage of resources exceeds the sustainable pace and capacity of the ecosystem. Overpopulation is when the usage of resources exceeds the sustainable pace and capacity of the ecosystem because there are too many people.
Obviously, very different. But who is being asked to consume less? Is it lions? I mean, they do eat a lot, but no, that's not who's being asked to consume less. It's humans, because we're uniquely able to have morals, but also have a greedy nature we have to resist to make the sacrifice and return to monkey.
You see, the problem with climate change is really the problem with humans. We're not a prevention folk. We're an angrily lash out at our lack of preparation in the middle of a preventable emergency folk while eating tacos stuffed inside of chalupas.
It's not austerity, and it's not population control either. It's just reducing energy consumption. After all, energy production is evil, right? Something that greedy capitalists do to make smoke and money to profit. Ew, yuck. It's not the reason that the entire human population exists at the scale it does, or anything like that. So let's maybe think about how we, personally, can consume less.
What size is your carbon footprint?
The carbon footprint, that I don't know.
Whatever it is, the whole population of the world, make that a very, very big number.
How much carbon I produce? Is that it?
You mean the effect that my living has on the earth in terms of the products I consume?
The concept of the carbon footprint was created by marketers at BP to shift responsibility for pollution away from them and onto the customer. The way they manage this is by saying they provide a product, and demand is why. You demand it, we supply it. And that's pretty much how we're supposed to believe everything in a free market economy works. And while at some point it might have, it definitely hasn't since I've been alive. I mean, if production was dictated entirely by what was demanded, why would advertising with the purpose of creating demand for an already existing product, all advertising, even exist?
If you are between the ages of 3 and 8, please listen closely. Owning a Doinkit is now the only proof that you are not a baby.
Further, a number of studies from the likes of Harvard and Yale in recent years have shown that pretty much all of the messaging from all of the oil companies is this same demand-focused messaging, and any problem that you would have with them, they want you to have with your neighbor that doesn't recycle. It's your fault for needing so much of our horrible planet-killing energy. Oh, we do so regret having to supply this energy you demand of us with such fervor. In 1955, John S. Bugas, then VP of Ford Motor Company, proposed the term consumerism as a substitute for capitalism to better describe the American economy and illustrate what he called consumer sovereignty in a defense of the capitalist market economy. According to Bugas, the term consumerism would pin the tag where it actually belongs, on Mr. Consumer, the real boss and beneficiary of the American system. It would pull the rug right out from under our unfriendly critics who have blasted away so long and so loud at capitalism. Somehow, I just can't picture them shouting down with the consumers.
I mean, he was wrong about the last part. Look at the critics of capitalism in the neoliberal era. Look at BreadTube, look at NPOs and NGOs. All of the rhetoric is pinned on Mr. Consumer and his morals. The way Bougasse was wrong was actually quite beneficial for capital, though. People noticed environmental problems but didn't incorporate material analysis. Rather, they just want to moralize a better future into existence, putting out a demand, waiting for it to be supplied.
So for the most part, he was right. As 2015 Jason Hickel said, it's not overpopulation that causes climate change, it's overconsumption. But what if someone counters by articulating an argument about consumerism not actually driving capitalism? That kind of makes it sound like overconsumption is merely a symptom of a growth-addicted system. Capital is required to find ways to get people to consume more and more. It's a structural imperative. We have to target the real causes here. It's like 2018 Jason Hickel says, overconsumption is not the problem. It's merely a symptom of a growth-addicted system. Capital is required to find ways to get people to consume more and more. It's a structural imperative. We have to target the real causes here.
It sounds like we just need a new set of rules. I wonder if Jason Hickel might have some rules we could follow.
The Rules was a global network of activists and/or a marketing firm. I'm not really 100% sure what the difference is these days, but it's especially hard to nail down exactly what The Rules was because it never really put forward a firm description of itself. Formally, The Rules no longer exists, but its work continues as a co-op consultancy focused on data-driven research and strategy services for systems change called Culture Hack Labs, whose mission statement is to expose, disrupt, and shift cultural assumptions to create new narrative spaces for possibility, hope, and justice.
Storytelling is social justice.
I need to tell my story properly. I need to tell my story properly. I need to tell my story properly. The story!
Anyways, Jason Hickel was an influencer on hand for the organization, co-founded by Martin Kirk, another degrowth influencer, although one who seems content to be in the background a little bit more. Hickel apparently helped sculpt the foundational content of the org and continued to be a public representative for them throughout its existence, writing articles with Martin Kirk, like this one from 2017 with Fast Company entitled "Don't Be Scared About the End of Capitalism, Be Excited to Build What Comes Next." In this article, Hickel and Kirk call existing socialist states an unmitigated disaster while praising Scandinavian states. Ironic because imperialism's fast burning through of resources funds those states. They claim that their degrowth ideas of reducing GDP are informed by up-to-date science and that they focus on regenerating rather than simply using up our planet's resources. They talk about how to live well within ecological boundaries and that we should draw on indigenous knowledge and lore about how to stay in balance with nature, an incredibly reductive fetishist statement that leans on the stereotype of the noble savage. Most importantly, Hickel and Kirk, representing The Rules at the time, tell us how we are overshooting Earth's carrying capacity by a crushing 64% each year in terms of our resource use and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if you were to ask them if they were talking about overpopulation, they would say no. But consider that the reason the population is 8 billion rather than a fraction of that is industrialization, the mechanizing of resource use. Population growth didn't pick up speed until the Industrial Revolution, when methods of energy output that could sustain larger populations were invented. Making drastic reductions in energy output will kill people. Temporary, incidental power outages in Texas killed hundreds in the winter of 2021. Imagine if that's just a daily thing. Sun's going down, uh-oh, it's a power outage. Hope you like cold, 'cause it's winter. So, where did the money The Rules used to promote the degrowth agenda come from? Well, Hickel and Kirk wowed investors like Ian McClelland of the HIF, which is the innovation funding arm of ELRA, a weirdly named global charity that finds solutions to complex humanitarian problems through research and innovation. So aside from whatever they bilked out of She-Ra or whatever, The Rules also took a lot of money from a nonprofit called Novo via a pass-through organization called Tides Foundation over the years. Novo money comes from Peter Buffett, son of Warren Buffett. Remember that club? Not the Rome one, not the billionaire capitalist that got people riled up about overpopulation several decades ago. The good one, the billionaire capitalist that got people all riled up about overpopulation 1 decade ago. Peter Buffett is the head honcho of Novo, which is funded by his dad, Good Club member Warren Buffett. In September of 2021, Peter posted an article on his Facebook feed written by Robert Jensen entitled Restless and Relentless Minds, Thinking as a Species Out of Context. I've put this article on screen so many times at this point, you'll recognize it, but I want to quote something of interest from this article. So here's an AI voice set to excited to read some pretty choice stuff for you.
Is the current 8 billion people at the current level of aggregate consumption sustainable? Is an even larger population continuing to consume at current levels sustainable? I do not believe either of those possibilities is plausible. That means that we need to act today to make possible a future with fewer and less. Fewer people, consuming less. How many fewer? How much less? Again, no one knows or can know for certain. But as we make choices today, we have to make our best guess. For purposes of starting honest conversations about public policy, I assume the answer is no more than half the current population consuming no more than half the resources used today. That likely won't be enough, but it's a start.
Just to clarify, this is Peter Buffett-described great mind Robert Jensen calling for reducing the world population by half as a start. This is the Good Club member's son that funded the rules as they told us first that overconsumption is the problem, and then that overconsumption was a symptom of capitalism, and that the real problem is growth, not population. It's not population, guys.
The question is what level of consumption, what level of population and what level of consumption can the planet handle? And nobody knows the answer to that. If you were to ask me my gut feeling, I would probably say 1 to 2 billion human beings living at maybe an 80% reduction in the kind of energy that we in the US currently consume. That seems like a plausible answer.
So the money says one thing in pretty plain terms, and the guy saying stuff on behalf of the money is claiming that's not really the case. But it's always been the case, even going back to Marx debunking Malthus.
Malthus also wishes to see the freest possible development of capitalist production, however, only insofar as the condition of this development is the poverty of the working class, which he wants to adapt itself to the consumption needs of the aristocracy and its branches in state and church, to serve as the material basis for the antiquated claims of the representatives of interests inherited from feudalism and the absolute monarchy.
Here, Marx says Malthus supports capitalism as long as the wealth extracted from the working class's labor is used to preserve the position and comfort of the aristocracy. This is part of Marx's overall argument that Malthus was essentially inventing ways to justify the oppression of poor people and to indirectly rebuke the French Revolution with pseudoscience. The aristocracy, whom Malthus represented, saw itself as inherently above commoners and that they deserved to be upheld by their lessers. Malthus saw the revolution in France as the product of these lessers not knowing their place. See, the world is just when the lessers stay in their tiny houses and consume less. They must expect less so the capitalist ruling class can continue to have more. You see, they're the smarter, better people because God chose them. Accept less, lessers. Less is more. For you, anyway. These ideologies continue to crop up from time to time, although we have replaced God with an invisible hand. In 1973, the year after Limits was published, an economist named E.F. Schumacher published a collection of essays entitled Small is Beautiful. The point, more or less, was to tell people that bigger isn't actually better. Smaller is better. Less is more.
Tiny houses, less consumption, less energy demand, less industrialization, less industry, less civilization. We should be centering indigenous voices for their inherent magical knowledge, their innate spirituality. They're so much more in tune with nature, so much nobler, so pure. We should all be living like that, on $2.50 a day. We shouldn't be trying to simply solve these problems. We clearly can't in capitalism. We should just ignore them, and the capitalist ruling class will decide what to do, you see. We should just retreat into a small cabin in the woods and write about blowing society up. Yeah,
Small is beautiful ideology is credited to Schumacher, but as with much of this, it isn't new. Again, I'll just hand it over to our man Rajani Palm Dutt, who dismantled it in 1934.
An example of the popularization by finance capital of this reactionary propaganda in its most fantastic form may be noted in an article prominently published in the millionaire-owned Sunday Express under the title, "Make Way for the Small Man," denouncing the illusion of progress and the failure of mass production and calling for the return to the small owner as the ideal. Quoting the Sunday Express article, "The unit of the self-supporting state is the self-supporting farm with first thoughts for subsistence and only second thoughts for the market, which might be mainly next door and consist of craftsmen supplying the needs of neighboring farms. This simple farm and craft relationship is essential to the health and wealth of any civilization. We should try to recover it." End quote. The finance capitalists would be highly indignant if this infantile propaganda, which they broadcast by the most highly developed mass production for the befogging of their readers, was suggested to be seriously applied to their own mammoth undertakings, including their mammoth press. The preaching of monopoly capital against monopoly is an old story. Return to handwork. Return to the Stone Age. Such is the final logical working out of the most advanced capitalism and fascism.
So, whether it's Malthus pushing overpopulation concerns to support the aristocracy, the Club of Rome pushing the limits to growth in support of international finance capital, the Schumacher Institute pushing small is beautiful, the Good Club pushing its agenda through philanthropy, or various degrowth influencers funded by the capitalist class, either directly or through NGOs/NPOs and pass-through organizations, it seems obvious who benefits. It's the ruling class.
Whether anybody who pushes overpopulation rhetoric genuinely believes or cynically employs it, I don't know. I can't say what's going on in other people's minds, but guess what? I don't actually care at this point. Every one of these people could be dead serious about believing in overpopulation being our most pressing concern or straight up lying. It doesn't change the outcome. So long as the capitalist mode of production exists, artificially restricting the productive forces will always eventually be necessary due to the system's inherent contradictions. A population will be reduced, maybe because of some insane Nazi-esque eugenics solution, or maybe because of a world war. Maybe the former causes the latter. Maybe just austerity and coercive ideology is put in place. Regardless of how, it's utterly necessary, and I'll tell you why. It's not because the population is consuming too much. It's because the mode of production doesn't work. The capitalist ruling class has the power because, as I said earlier, power comes from production. If you own production, you own if people eat, among many other things. In the imperial mode, one which grows markets until they're no longer sustainable and then degrows them, redrawing territorial boundaries, there's an inherent flaw that causes cyclical crises. Let's talk about industrial society and its past.
According to Marx's critique of capitalism, the things we purchase and consume are only as valuable as the amount of labor that's necessary to produce them. Technological innovation reduces the amount of labor necessary to produce something, so according to Marx's paradigm, that thing becomes less valuable, at least in terms of what someone will pay for it at market.
You see, every single time an old person says they don't make them like they used to, they're completely right.
Technology and technique develop. What was once handmade becomes machine-made. This development alone causes things to cost less to make. When a material that takes labor to be mined and refined can be replaced with plastic, we find the further reduction of labor continuing to reduce the cost. Capitalists who get to technological innovations first are the ones who benefit most from this lowered production cost, as the new technology takes time to become adopted as the production standard. Once it does, all the would-be competing products cost the same or nearly the same to make, and so it costs less to buy, because not only does this process cause inflation, but people aren't going to pay a premium for something that's not made how it used to be. Despite this, demand for a product that people need will likely stay the same. Even if the demand for something stays the same, while less labor is required to produce it, the value of that thing still goes down. Therefore, the profit margin goes down as capital must produce the same numbers of this now cheaper thing to fulfill demand. This is called the falling rate of profit. It is baked into our economic system. It is totally unavoidable, assuming technology progresses. Because of this, it isn't actually in the interests of capitalists to fulfill demand in the long term. In fact, if capitalists continually focused on supplying specifically to fulfill demand, they'd eventually go out of business. Hence, degrowth.
The modern development of technique and productive powers has reached a point at which the existing capitalist forms are more and more incompatible with the further development of production and utilization of technique. To the modern bourgeois mind and outlook, this process of restricting of production in the midst of poverty appears as a natural and self-evident necessity. Without a sense of contradiction, they proclaim the policy of restriction of production with the same sense of obvious correctness and common sense with which they preached after the war, the policy of increased production as the path to prosperity. Correctly, they feel no contradiction since both are indispensable to the maintenance of capitalism at the present stage.
Degrowth is an ideology that naturalizes and stabilizes the falling rate of profit under capitalism. It shifts the responsibility of capitalism's inability to provide for those outside of the ruling class to controlling consumption habits and forcing austerity measures on the masses. The degrowth agenda is generally built around reducing demand for energy and, therefore, everything, to the point where 100% intermittence is a viable situation that could actually provide enough power for the total societal usage. This is, I must stress, a massive reduction in energy production and will kill people if actually implemented.
Degrowth advocates, funded and/or promoted by capital, are forcing a discourse about a hypothetical artificial limitation of production and technological progress, and that's where the conversation stays. With the people in Congress and the Oval Office, it's marketing, and they don't need everyone to sign on. In fact, if everyone splits into factions and argues about which ideals are better, rather than what the system does and who benefits, it's easier for them to avoid any kind of accountability at all. Because the people who would devise a way to organize labor to subvert this are instead arguing about which brands to buy or if we should all become trad, anarcho-primitivist, or localist. Should we start a community garden, ban cars tomorrow, and stop having kids for 5 years? Are people the real virus? Should we just move to the country and eat a lot of peaches? What is right for me individually as a person to do? What are the right ideals? What are the right morals? What is good and what is bad? This is what this flawed system needs us to be asking if people are going to be noticing that there are problems, rather than questions about the relationships and conditions that create this situation.
Energy companies are ultimately finance capital. According to Lenin, finance capital is monopoly industrial capital merged with bank capital, which actually doesn't require a single Jew to be involved at all, as some idiot is probably going to assert in either the comments or response video. Roughly 80% of US energy is generated by investor-owned utilities. With some scrutiny, we can see why energy companies are pushing windmills and solar panels. We can see why they fund non-profits that push these types of energy paradigms, and why they're happy to have degrowth influencers peddling a theory of radical abundance. So, why? Well, finance capital wins no matter what plays out. If demand-focused rhetoric succeeds in keeping the working class attempting to adjust its demand in service of maintaining a ruling class's supremacy, as Marx pointed out Malthus's lampoon was intended to do, then it can't or won't organize some kind of power to leverage against the energy production sector or the capitalist ruling class itself. Instead, energy companies get to operate intermittent renewables that they own, providing the image of a green future with a natural gas baseload that they also own. Or, if idealist, true believer degrowth environmentalists and their politicians were to actually achieve green austerity and it starves or freezes enough people to actually degrow energy demand, then we have to remember what I just said a second ago, that these massive companies own the quote-unquote green infrastructure. They will have cornered a growing market, ironically enough. Regardless, the current situation where an owning class holds control of everything is perpetuated. That's all that matters here. Everything is in service of that. If that was possible to maintain with intermittent electricity and without any kind of austerity, so people would be comfortable and not complain, we'd already be doing that. It's not, though. There are both ideological and mechanical contradictions that are impossible to ignore here. So the dichotomy they give us is sacrifice the environment or sacrifice some people. They don't word it that way, but that's the choice. And which one people choose isn't something the imperial capitalist ruling class actually gives a shit about. They want different groups of people to make different choices and argue with each other. They actually don't want a definitive outcome. Even they go back and forth, claiming we need to grow in one sector, degrow in another, and then switch them up. Why? Because they have to. Cyclical crises will occur due to the inherent contradictions in capitalism. The falling rate of profit will introduce decay and hollow out industries while others surge into existence. Either the capitalist ruling class really believes that they are the superior humans who deserve to exclusively consume the resources on this planet to the point they will kill us, whether by policy or other means, or they're cynically advocating for debunked crap that would kill us in order to keep us away from their wealth and position as the ruling class. Either way, they're full of shit.
Maybe you figured this out by now. Also, I've said it a couple of times, but I'm not the Uno Boomer. I'm just dressed like this, so when I say something satirical, it hits a little harder. It's actually you. You are supposed to be the Uno Boomer. So, why does the Uno Boomer boom? Because rather than combine all this stuff going on, rather than connect the dots, synthesize knowledge, and understand relationships, you're supposed to want catharsis, a quick fix. You're not supposed to be interested in contradictions. You're supposed to be interested in Algonquin words like Wetiko, a mind virus driven by greed, excess, and selfish consumption that our society is supposedly sick with. You're supposed to be stuck on what your neighbor's consuming rather than where the capitalist ruling class is taking us, or even that there is a capitalist ruling class that unaccountably makes all the decisions about society because they literally own everything. And if that's getting you down, you're just supposed to want to boom everything and everyone. After all, what's a few lives when there's a surplus population? Less is supposed to seem like more. Less buildings, less pollution, less people, more booming. General booming, though. Nothing that can actually change anything. Just scary stuff aimed at humanity the virus. And either you're a total psycho and you follow through, not the typical route, but it does happen, but more likely, you watch the ending of Fight Club and ugly cry. You watch the Ted Kaye movie and think he was just some misunderstood genius. You watch ContraPoints while drinking a bottle of wine and spiraling. You're supposed to look out at the unwashed masses and think there's too many people making too many problems, and there's just not much love to go around. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be a land of confusion. We can't boom everything. That's an insane thought. There's no way to start over, as many seem to want. History has happened. It's made its mark. America exists, and even if it didn't tomorrow, its effects would remain. Whatever follows will retain some kind of American characteristics, even if it goes in the opposite direction. That is the dialectic of history. We don't need less people. We need a different arrangement of power. We need a system of society that resolves the contradictions Marx and Engels identified in the 1800s, while other idiots were telling everyone that there were too many people to mask the contradictions in one way or another. Clearly, that hasn't stopped. And they keep trying to refine their rhetoric so we don't notice they're telling us there's too many people on Earth. It's consumption, it's not population. Who's doing the consuming, though? If the infrastructure that people use to live is reduced, then less people can live. And some people truly believe this is the only path forward, and outwardly say so, like Robert Jensen calling to halve the human population in his Restless and Relentless Minds article that Peter Buffett shared on Facebook. Some people cynically put it forward. Marx asserted Malthus himself was possibly just working to propagandize against the French Revolution to justify the position of the newly outdated feudal aristocracy. A lot of people assert that Margaret Sanger cynically put forward her racist eugenic worldview and worked with KKK members, even putting one on her board, to normalize birth control. And just to be clear, I personally consider birth control being acceptable to be a good outcome. But I also can't tell you what was going on in her head. That bitch said some pretty fucked up shit. Fuck her. Capitalists have for many, many years claimed to care about the unsustainable population for one reason or another. The Buffett father and son have talked about population a lot. Peter, as the head of Novo, putting money into various weirdos' pockets, and Warren as a member of the Good Club, which a 2009 Guardian article called "The First Time a Group of Donors on This Level of Wealth Has Met Behind Closed Doors in What Is in Essence a Billionaires Club." Yeah, that's the first time capitalists have met in private, I'm sure. Oh wait, it's not, because that's exactly what the Club of Rome was, an organization that was founded in 1968 to advocate for a regulatory body made up of the world's biggest capitalists, presumably to give them more control to follow whatever plans they have. Or, more bluntly, the World Planning Congress in Amsterdam in 1931, where the world's biggest capitalists met to propose various schemes to create a planned capitalism, ultimately impossible while retaining capital's defining contradiction of socialized production and privatized appropriation. If the point is to retain the ownership of capital that creates class, rationally planning is impossible. Resources get moved around according to costs and profits, not quantities needed. To truly plan a global, imperial stage capitalism, the anarchy of production has to be entirely beaten, not just mostly. Outcomes have to be enforced because otherwise the falling rate of profit makes sustained planning impossible. Do you know what we call that? Fascism. Like, actually. Not like the Umberto Eco listicle aesthetic bullshit. I mean real-ass fascism. The thing that people like Rajani Palm-Dutt, whom I've cited pretty extensively, and others have scientifically researched, excavating a defining character. Fascism is the only coherent result of the fact that the form of private ownership of the means of production we call capitalism can no longer develop. To continue to exist uninterrupted, the system has to generate violent crises, stagnation, and decay. Fascism is an advanced stage of capitalism in crisis. And as this world crisis grows, the number of unemployed, desolate people goes up while it becomes more and more necessary to lower the costs of production. Like I said, capitalist exploitation can no longer be coerced, it can only be enforced. Degrowth's reactionary lineage through insistence of the preservation of capitalism's ownership dynamics, whether fully intentional or conveniently ignored, promoted by the capitalist ruling class, back through idealist small is beautiful environmentalism and eugenics, the determination and designation of what parts of the population we call through various pseudosciences, all the way back to Robert Thomas Malthus and his defense of stuffed shirt aristocrats who spent all day fucking their cousins' brains out. This reactionary lineage is telling you that the problems of the world are the fault of your neighbors. They're telling you that you are better than your neighbors, but worse than the rulers. And whatever they decide to do is always the right thing to do. They got there because of God, or the invisible hand, or birthright, or whatever. They're the smartest. Their asset holdings and bank accounts are the evidence that tell you this is so. Yes, capitalism requires growth, but only some of the time. The falling rate of profit is also going to require the limitation of production at other times. Thus, capitalism also requires degrowth. Imperial stage capitalism just cycles back and forth between crises and decay, one always being the way out of the other. And the era of imperial capitalism has gone on for a very, very long time, much longer than I've even been alive. And it's cycled in exactly this way. The cycle just decays more and more. As long as we don't progress to a higher stage of production, one which resolves capitalism's fatal flaws that create class and nullify the human talent to plan with our brains, this is how it's going to be. Humanity isn't the problem here. Limited resources are not the problem here. Carbon production isn't even the problem here. If capitalists could handle moving to a higher form of energy production like nuclear, which produces literally zero emissions, we'd already have done it. The problem is that this system cannot accommodate doing things purely for the sake of making the world better. Either it's gotta be for profit or for the maintenance of class. And in that way, humanity is also the solution. Most of us know that this is bullshit. We might not understand why, and a lot of us are misled because we've only heard lies, but you're here, right? It's actually the best part about humanity. We are here. There are a whole lot of us, and most of us are not in the ruling class. Like, so many that the tiny numbers of people in society's ruling classes have spent centuries promoting various personalities, thinkers, and rhetoric saying there's too many people. Humanity is the solution. We can all live better lives. We can all live in abundance. None of this bullshit is real. It's fake. It's been disproven and debunked over and over and over. Of course they think there's too many people. We outnumber them by billions.